Good morning and welcome to our Zoom at the Langley Centennial Museum. We're here with Shannon, who's going to teach us a little bit about transportation and how that has changed over time. So Shannon, you can take it away.
Thanks, Haley. So Lacey, since we're in this little private session or smaller session today, I'm just going to keep you unmuted the whole time, and then we can just have a conversation. And Lindsay, because I know you've got lots going on in your life right now, feel free to unmute and join the conversation at any time. And thank you for sharing your little one with us this morning. Amazing. Okay, so Lacey, as you know, I'm not a pro with Zoom. So when you can't see anything I'm sharing, just please speak up because I know we've been there before. So I'm going to share this screen. Okay, so can you guys see what I'm sharing? Bunch of pictures, awesome. So I didn't tell Haley that she shouldn't have spoiled the fun for us this morning, but that's okay. So we might have given it away a little bit, Lacey. But so we're looking at 5 images here. So I just want you to take a second. So those of you who are watching this later at home as well. So I'd like you just to take a second and look at these 5 pictures on the screen. And I want you to think for a moment, what are each of those images and what do they have in common? And then if you think you know, put up your hand.
Some kind of transportation?
Yeah, you're right. So I sense a little bit of confusion in your voice. And the reason is that one of them is a little bit tricky. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. I did that intentionally just so it was a little bit hard. Okay, my screen should have changed a little bit. Do you see more words? Ah, excellent. So you're absolutely right. So these 5 pictures represent transportation. And in fact, they represent the most common modes of transportation in Canada today. So we had trains, we had boats, we had airplanes down on the bottom left, we have motor vehicles on the bottom right. And the one that I threw in just because it's a little bit tricky is pipelines. So we're not going to talk much about those today, but those are actually one of the most common modes of transportation in Canada. And while they don't transport people, they are technically considered ways that we can transport things because they move water and oil and gas all the way across the country. Okay, so the next one for you. So we have 5 images again. Some of them are the same, some of them are different. And I want you to think about what these specifically have in common. So they're modes of transportation, but there's something else that they have in common. Put up your hand if you think you know.
Transporting people?
Oh, you're right. You know what? They do all transport people. That's an excellent suggestion. And yes, you're absolutely right. They do transport people, but there's one other, well, there's a few things they have in common. They all have engines. They're all quite big. They're all heavy. They can all move people, but they can also move goods. They can move shipping too. But they're also all powered by fuel. So these are all powered by gas or diesel, so a type of fuel. So there's the gas-powered car, there's gas-powered plane, gas-powered helicopter, a diesel-powered locomotive engine, and a diesel-powered semi-truck. Now, here's 5 new images. Think for a second about how are these powered. Put up your hand if you have a guess. Now, they're not all the same. Yeah, go ahead, Lacey.
Some of them are powered by humans?
Yeah, exactly. So we have the steam-powered locomotive. So that's powered by steam. So we're going to heat up some water and make steam, and that's the source of fuel for that engine. We have an electric car. So like a Tesla or a smart car, there's lots of powered cars right now, which is fantastic. The bicycle is powered by humans. The bottom left was a tricky one because it's an old photo. It's a horse-drawn carriage. So like the bicycle, it's manual powered. So it's driven by a horse or pulled by, an ox. And then we have the SkyTrain, which is an electric car or electric train. So these are examples of modes of transportation that run on what we call renewable energy. Do you know what renewable energy means?
You can use it.
Yeah, it's a big word. So if we think sustainable sources or renewable energy, so think about the difference between when you're throwing something in the trash or you're throwing something in the recycling. What's the difference? What's going in the recycling is getting reused, it's getting repurposed, it's less wasteful, it's better for the environment. What we call renewable energy is the same idea. So when you're running something with your feet on a bicycle or by power or by steam, it's much, much, much less harmful to the environment because we're not using up a source of fuel like gas or coal or diesel. Now, here's a tricky one for you. So we have 6 modes of transportation on the screen that we just talked about. We have trains, the horse-drawn carriage, bicycles, airplanes, pipelines, and cars. Can you put these modes of transportation in the order that they were invented? I'll give you and then anyone who's watching this later at home just a minute to think about it because it's actually pretty tricky. I had to do a lot of research to do this myself. I wonder if even Miss Haley has some guesses.
I suppose I could. My guess, well, horses I think would be one of the first ones, but you have horse-drawn carriage on there. So I still think that's early because if you think of like Little House on the Prairie, mind you, there were trains in Little House on the Prairie. So, you know, I'm going to defer to your knowledge and your expertise on this one.
So what do you think is so Lacey, what do you think is the very first one?
The horse-drawn carriage.
You're right. And then maybe Miss Haley, what do you think is the last one? Out of everything on the screen, what do you think is the one that was invented the most recently?
Pipelines.
No.
Really?
Yeah. So I just assigned these to numbers just in case we had a big group. I just wanted people to be able to show their numbers. So I'm just going to go to the next slide here. Okay, so you're both right. The horse-drawn carriage is by far the oldest. So there's records of carriages being drawn by horses, by oxes, cows, any large animal going back to 3000 BC in Mesopotamia. So that's one of the ancient civilizations that's now the part of Western Asia or the Middle East. The steam-powered locomotive engine was invented in 1804 in the United States. Now, there were earlier versions of trains, but that was the first time we saw steam-powered engines. Bicycles were invented about 10 or 15 years later, 1817 in Germany. Now, pipelines are actually quite old. There is records of very, very early pipelines being made out of wood and other materials going back about 200 or more years. But the first long distance modern, by modern I mean metal, so similar to the materials we use today, a cast iron pipeline was built throughout Canada in 1853. But as I said, some pipes have been around for much, much longer. Cars were actually also invented in Germany or France. I guess there's a lot of debate as to who built it first, but about 1884, 1885. So that's almost 100 years after trains. And then airplanes were actually the most recent out of those 6 examples. The first airplane, the first kind of more modern type airplane, was built by the Wright brothers, of course. They're very famous for developing airplanes in 1903 in the USA. So airplanes are actually just over 100 years old. Lacey, what do you think surprised you most about that list?
I think the pipelines. I thought they were more recent.
Yeah, right? But there's actually been some, of course, people have been getting around since the beginning of time. What's changed is how we get around, right? So now we're going to go right back to Canada. So Canada, we talked about there was trains, boats, I mean, of course, we have all of the different types of transportation in Canada, right? So you might find yourself walking somewhere one day, hopping in a car the next, and then maybe, you know, maybe when everything goes back to normal, you might be getting on a plane sometime soon too. So we had trains, boats, pipelines, planes, and cars. It's the 5 most common examples of transportation in Canada. So let's just explore those a little bit. Now, boats in Canada. So boats are pretty old, right? Like, so boats have been around since the beginning of time, because especially in Canada, the First Nations people relied on those waterways. So they used the water for fishing, for drinking, for washing, but also for transportation. It was very common for the first people to have to use the riverways to get from one area to the next, or to go to their fishing villages for the summer, and just to move around between their communities. But then, of course, today we rely on so many different types of water transportation, or different types of boats for transportation, for fishing, but then also for recreation. When was the last time you went on a boat, Lacey?
Well, we went to my grandma and grandpa's lake house,
Yeah.
and I go on the stand-up paddleboard.
Oh, nice. So that's a type of boat too. So that runs off of renewable energy, right? Because it's not using gas or coal or diesel, or it's not burning any type of fuel. You're powering it by yourself. I know I grew up in Alberta, so I actually didn't go on a boat for a long time. I mean, we went out to the lake and we went on a little raft, but I had never been on a big boat. Oh, probably in my travels a little bit, but since I moved out here, of course, like boats are almost a part of our everyday life for some of us who have to go to and from the islands. Now, trains. So trains are pretty old as well. So very early in our history in Canada, in the 1700s, so this is about 300 years ago, pioneers used very primitive, so really, really old-fashioned railway systems in eastern Canada for transporting stone and building supplies just across short distances. So we didn't have long-distance trains all the way back then. In 1836, the first true railway, so something that's more resemblant to what we have today, was built in still eastern Canada, but what is now called Quebec, just to move goods. So it wasn't moving people at that time. About 30 years later, in 1867, when Canada became a country, they promised an intercontinental railway to all of the provinces. So that was a deal that they made. They said, okay, well, British Columbia, if you're going to join the Confederation of Canada, we are going to build you a train. So then, about 20 years later, as I'm sure you guys all talk about in school, the last spike, so the end of the Trans-Canada Railroad was put into the ground in 1885. And a year later, the first train went from Montreal all the way to Port Moody. So that was the first trip the passengers took all the way across the train. Now, it says on here, but I'm kind of hoping you haven't read that part yet. Do you think it was a long journey or a short one? I'm going to unmute you there, Lacey. I'm hitting so many buttons. There we go. You can read ahead, that's okay.
Reading.
So see if you can get to the part at the very end as to how long that journey was. It might surprise you, because right now we can fly from, last time I flew from Vancouver to Montreal, I think it was 6 hours.
1 month later?
1 month, yeah. So that's 4 weeks on a plane. Can you imagine spending 4 weeks, on a train? Can you imagine spending 4 weeks on a train? That's a long time, hey? Now, even today, trains do move quite slowly. So if you want to take a train from Vancouver to Edmonton, it's a 12-hour drive by car, but I believe it takes about 16 or 17 hours by train. So they do move in Canada, they move quite slower. Now, if you go to places like Asia, like in Japan or in China, I went on a train when I was in China. They have very fancy bullet trains that go up to 330 kilometers an hour. So those are crazy fast trains, but we don't have those in North America. So cars in Canada, even before cars were being mass produced in the USA. So the first cars recorded in the United States were in 1885. So that's about the same time that Germany and France and other parts of Europe were making them as well. But actually, the first car in Canada was built by a man named Henry Taylor in 1867. So that car looked a lot like this little funny picture that we have there. So that's what the very first cars looked like. So they were very different than the cars we have today. Now, 30 years later, cars are being imported from the States, and the first car manufacturing company was built by Ford in 1904 in Canada. So that's actually pretty recent. That's just over 110, 15 years ago. Now, less than 10 years after that factory was built, there were over 50,000 cars in Canada. And shortly after that, Canada became the world's second biggest producer of cars. So that's a huge jump from having just one car in Canada to 30 years later, we have 50,000 cars in Canada. And then now today, we produce the 8th biggest number of cars. So there's other countries that produce much more cars than we do, but actually more than 80% of the cars that we make in Canada are actually exported. They're sent to other countries.
What's the country that has the largest amount of cars made?
Oh, you know what? That's a great question, Lacey. And I'm going to look that up for you. But maybe that's something. I think it's the USA. I'm pretty sure it's the USA because they have all of the factories there. But that's a really great question, and I will look up that list later. So I think you could probably Google that with your parents too, and be like top car manufacturers. And I think it will probably go something like USA, and then parts of Europe and Asia, and then Canada. But if you look around, and you've probably noticed this too, there's a lot of cars in Canada that don't come from Canada, right? So we have, I know my car, like I've got a Ford Focus that was built in Canada. It's got the block heater. It was designed for Canadian winters. That's probably one of the cars that was built in Canada, or at least in North America. But I know lots of people, like the Mazdas, the Hondas, like those are all Japanese cars that might be built in American factories, but they come in, they're imported into Canada. So airplanes was next. So we were a little bit on the fence about airplanes. We weren't sure how old or how new that they were. So the Wright brothers in the USA invented the first airplane in 1903. But Canadians have actually been involved in making airplanes since just after that. And that was a really cool fact that I got to research when I was preparing for this. So even though planes were mostly made in the States in the very, very early days, we actually had several Canadians, including the very famous Alexander Graham Bell, who worked in New York to build a plane called the Red Wing in 1908. Now, a man named F.W. Baldwin was actually the very first Canadian to ever go on a plane. So in 1908, they built a little plane that was this one here in the picture called the Red Wing. And then Mr. Baldwin got to fly it around. So do you think that they flied for long distances in 1908? What do you think, Lacey?
Can you say that again? My brother
Do you think that they flied for long distances or short distances?
Short distances.
Short distances, right? So when Mr. Baldwin took that plane ride in 1908, it was probably just for 5 or 10 minutes. I don't think he would have gone too far. The first flight in Canada was done by an American named Charles Hamilton in 1911, and they went from Richmond to New Westminster. Now, that doesn't sound like it's very far, right? Like, I think I could drive from Richmond to New Westminster in about 20 minutes if I take that back road. But that was a big deal, right? So that was a huge deal to fly from two cities in an airplane over 100 years ago. Now, the very first international mail delivery, and I thought that this was a really cool fact. So the first time mail was ever delivered by plane anywhere in the world from country to country was actually in Canada. So they took 60 letters in a plane from Vancouver to Seattle in 1919. So that's a pretty big deal because never before that time had they taken a plane from one country to the next country with some post. Now, have you been on a passenger plane? Put your hand up if you've been on a plane somewhere. Yeah? So passenger planes have been actually flying a little bit around Canada since 1920. So that's exactly 100 years ago. but only on a very limited capacity. So like we just talked about, only going very short distances. They started to go a bit further. I believe the first passenger flight in Canada was actually in Manitoba. It went from Winnipeg up into northern Manitoba, but it only took 2 people at that time. The first time that they flew from Vancouver to Seattle, that was a huge deal. And they had 10 people on that plane. So those planes are going much shorter distances and they're much smaller than today. So since then, air travel has become so common that Canada has over 160 million people that go on and off planes in Canada every single year. So that's quite a huge jump, right? So 1920, we're seeing maybe 10, 12, 15 people fly by plane. And now we have over 160 million people, not just Canadians, but other people that come in and out of Canada all the time by plane. So the last one, and then I put this in there initially because it is, like I said, one of the most common modes of transportation in Canada. But I also put that in that first kind of guessing game just to make your brain question a little bit. So like we talked about, pipelines, they don't move people, but they are one of the most common modes of transportation in Canada because they're used to move goods. They're used to move liquid and gas goods. So they go great distances. And while we talked about they've been around for quite a long time, today there's actually more than 840,000 kilometers of pipeline in Canada. And I did some quick math, and I believe that's enough to wrap the entire planet Earth 20 times over. So that's a huge amount of pipelines. And now they're not all moving oil and things like that, but there's lots of smaller pipelines that just get water to the communities, to different parts of Canada. So they've played a big role in our transportation history as well. Haley? Oh, okay, I was looking for a clock there. I couldn't see my clock, but I now realize what time it is. So that works out. So for those of you who are with us today, and then those of you who are watching this later at home, and Lacey, you can always pull this video off of Facebook too. So we've got a couple activity suggestions for you. So thinking about everything that we talked about today, so all of those crazy facts about transportation. And for the last 6 or 7 weeks, I don't know, it's gone by so fast because we're having so much fun in these sessions. We've been talking about pioneer families in Langley. So I would challenge you to think about if you're an early pioneer, you're traveling all the way across Canada by train, maybe on that very first train ride in 1886, and you and your brother, sister, your family have 1 month on a train. So maybe you could start writing a little bit of a journal. Maybe you could journal what your first 7 days on that train would look like, how you would keep yourself busy. Now you don't have computers, you don't have iPods, you don't have Spotify, you don't have, video games. So what are you going to do for 1 month on that train ride? And maybe think about some of the conversations you'd have, some of the ways you'd keep yourself busy, and some of the ways you would just share experiences with your friends and family on that train to pass the time. Now, another challenge I have for you is if you couldn't use any gas-powered transportation for a week, what would you and your family do? So I know for me, I'm lucky enough to live close to stores, but I'm at least a 35-minute walk or a 15-minute bike ride to the nearest store. And many people in Langley live in rural communities and they depend on their cars or public transportation to get around. So if you couldn't use a car, a bus, a truck for a week, what would you do? Does your family have an electric car? Would you have to walk everywhere? Would you have to cycle? Or would you just lock yourself down and try to ration out your cupboards and stay put? And then the last little challenge I have for you is maybe a little bit more of a fun one that requires a little bit less or a little bit more creative thinking, is think about what your dream car would look like and draw it out on a piece of paper. But also I would challenge you to think about, how is it powered? Can it be powered with a renewable source of energy instead of gas or diesel? Okay, so I'm just going to open it up if you have any quick questions or comments before we end. I know now for the first time there's a session after us, so I do have to stay on time. Otherwise, Miss Haley will be angry. Lacey, I'm going to unmute you there, or unmute yourself. So do you have any, what surprised you the most about transportation in Canada?
Well, I didn't know that pipelines were so old.
Yeah, that surprised me too, actually. But I guess we've been moving stuff around Canada for so long, and even very early pipelines, if they had, like way back in the day, the pioneer families would have to get water from their well. But I suppose as soon as they had that technology to be able to pipe out water and deliver it to a building, even on the farm, that was considered a pipeline. Now, what do you wonder the most? What is your biggest question that you might want to research after this?
How long it took for them to build the first airplane?
That's a great, and you know what? I bet YouTube is so fantastic. I'm using YouTube, I think, more than now than I ever have in my life. I think that would be a great little YouTube video that you and your brother could watch, History of Airplanes. And I know that there's lots of material out there to learn about the Wright brothers and how important they were in the history of aircraft. Okay, so wow. Hey, it is exactly 10 o'clock. We did great.
Awesome. Well, sorry.
Yeah.
I was just going to say thank you so much for sharing that with us. It was interesting because I made a connection to what we did yesterday with the fort. So yesterday, Amin at Fort Langley National Historic Site was teaching us about how they started fire back in the day, and we talked about how technology for starting fire has changed over time. The goal has still been to start fire, but it's gotten more efficient and quicker and easier. And so it's kind of the same with transportation, because the goal of transportation has always been to move people and goods from one place to another. But as our technology changes, it has gotten faster and more efficient over time. And it's interesting to see how much faster people were able to move and things are able to move. And now, like, you can order something on Amazon from the other side of the world and it can be here in a few days. And
absolutely.
So it's really interesting looking at our place in space and time, and how right now everything moves so quickly, and we get the things we want and need really quick. So
well, and you're absolutely right, because like when I was doing some research for this too, like we all grow up at school and we learn about the train system in Canada and how much of an important role in history that was. But what I never really thought about before is, like you said, we were always moving things. So what I was able to give a little bit more thought to was, okay, well, even on, like, I grew up in a coal mining town, so I'm very familiar with the carts that they would use to move coal in the mines. And that is a type of train, right? So it might have been pulled by people or by animal, but putting a cart on a track is essentially a train. So like you said, they just got bigger and powered and faster and more efficient. So what went from maybe just moving a small wagon on a hand-built train track went from actually went to those bullet trains in Japan and China that are moving thousands of people every second. So that's really remarkable.
So, and then the other thing I was thinking about is one of the field trips that I almost always take my class on is the Footpaths to Freeways program at the Langley Centennial Museum. So I'm just gonna give a shout out to that, saying any teachers who are interested in this topic and helping their students understand how transportation and stuff has changed over time. Footpaths to Freeways, once everything's reopened again, is a great one that my students often really like and enjoy, and teaches us a lot about how Langley has changed and how the transportation systems have changed with the times in Langley. So
that's fantastic. Thanks so much for mentioning that, Haley. And for those teachers who are watching, even though things are pretty tough right now and we really don't know what September is going to look like, we are actively exploring ways to take as many of our programs as possible virtual, and to take them into your classrooms instead of coming into the museum. So we really want to get our programs out to you where we can.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And we will see you next week as we learn more about the past, more about history with the Langley Centennial Museum. So thank you very much. And we will see you next